May 2, 1976, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Thousands of fans waiting outside London's Victoria Station had been standing for hours to catch a glimpse of the era's most controversial rock star. David Bowie was about to board a train to Berlin, and nobody knew that the next 3 seconds would create one of rock music history's most scandalous moments. As the open-top Mercedes slowly passed in front of the station, Bowie stood up, waved to the crowd, and then did something. He raised his arm, straight, upward, palm open. He held it there for exactly 3 seconds. Cameras clicked, the moment froze, and the next morning, every newspaper in Britain carried the same question. Did David Bowie just give a Nazi salute? But this was far more complex than just a photograph, because what happened at Victoria Station that day was actually the climax of an 18-month collapse. Cocaine, paranoia, character loss, and the story of a man disappearing inside his own mind. And worst of all, Bowie himself might not have even known what he was doing in that moment. If this story intrigues you and you want to dive deep into David Bowie's dark period, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because over the next 20 minutes you're going to witness an untold story of collapse and redemption. But first, how did we get to that day? The man standing at Victoria Station in May 1976 was very different from the creative genius who had created Ziggy Stardust in 1972. The 4 years in between weren't just 4 years on a calendar. For Bowie, they were 4 life cycles, 4 different characters, 4 separate identity crises, and in the middle of it all, a steadily growing substance addiction. When the world met Ziggy Stardust in 1972, David Bowie was 30 years old, but his career had been going for a decade. Space Oddity had been a minor hit, but real success hadn't come. Then came Ziggy. Red hair, sequined costumes, platform boots, and the bisexuality announcement. The media went into shock, fans went wild, and for the first time in his life, Bowie became a star. But there was a problem. Ziggy was becoming more real than David Jones. Bowie would later confess, when he created Ziggy Stardust, he thought it was a performance. He'd go on stage, play the character, then return to being David backstage. But it didn't happen that way. Fans wanted Ziggy. The press wanted to talk to Ziggy. The record label wanted albums from Ziggy. And gradually, David Jones was disappearing. When he looked in mirrors, he didn't know who he was supposed to see. In July 1973, at that famous concert at Hammersmith Odeon, Bowie walked on stage and said, "This is not only the last show of the tour, but the last show Ziggy Stardust will ever do." The band members were shocked. Nobody knew. Bowie had killed Ziggy, but solving one problem created another. With Ziggy gone, who would be left? Over the next 18 months, Bowie created 2 new characters, Aladdin Sane and Halloween Jack, but neither caught on like Ziggy. And more importantly, neither filled the void inside Bowie. By mid-1974, another change came, the Diamond Dogs album and tour. Bowie was now creating a dystopian future, inspired by Orwell's 1984. But backstage, a real dystopia was unfolding. Cocaine use was increasing. Bowie was smoking 100 cigarettes a day. He was surviving on only milk and peppers, losing weight, purple circles forming under his eyes. And worst of all, his connection to reality was weakening. By the end of 1974, Bowie moved to America, Los Angeles. Sunshine, beaches, Hollywood stars, and unlimited cocaine. Here, he would create his darkest character, the Thin White Duke. Cold, distant, an aristocratic figure, the protagonist of the Station to Station album. But the Thin White Duke wasn't just a character. He was a reflection of Bowie's cocaine psychosis. Emotionless, paranoid, dangerous, and the most worrying part, Bowie could no longer see the line between character and reality. In late 1975 and early 1976, his home in Los Angeles had become a prison. Curtains always closed because Bowie believed witches were watching him. Mirrors were covered because he was afraid to see his reflection. When friends came to visit, he wouldn't open the door. One night, Mick Jagger managed to get inside, and the scene he witnessed horrified him. Bowie sitting on the floor, cocaine lines around him, drawing occult symbols on papers and reading Aleister Crowley's books. "David," Jagger said, "you need to get out of here." Bowie looked up, but there was no familiar light in his eyes. "David's not here," he whispered. "The Duke is here." Jagger never forgot that night, because he had lost his friend. Someone he didn't recognize had taken his place. During this period, the things Bowie said would haunt him for years. In one interview, he described Adolf Hitler as one of the first rock stars. In another interview, he said Britain needed a fascist leader. The cocaine was talking, but the words had made it into newspapers. And Victoria Station, that day, was when all this dark energy would explode at one point. The morning of May 2, 1976 began in Bowie's hotel room where he was temporarily staying in London. The previous night he had barely slept. For hours he had looked out the window, watching London streets thinking that something needed to change. Los Angeles was destroying him. He couldn't stay in America. He needed to go to Berlin. There, with Iggy Pop, maybe he could find himself. Maybe he could return to being David Jones. But first there was a train, and fans waiting at the train station. And the press. Always the press. When he left the hotel, the sunlight hurt his eyes. For the first time in months, he was stepping into daylight. His weight had dropped to 56 kilograms. Dangerously thin for a man 178 centimeters tall. His face was taut, bones protruding, eyes sunken, black trousers, white shirt, black vest. The thin white Duke had worn his uniform. When the Mercedes arrived, Bowie silently got into the back seat. The driver asked, "To the station. Is that right, Mr. Bowie?" Bowie just nodded. Inside his head, thousands of thoughts were spinning. What would he do in Berlin? Would he make music? Would he rest? Or was he just running away to another place? And what about the characters? Ziggy was dead. Aladdin was lost. Now Duke was about to go too. So what would be left? As they approached Victoria Station, he heard the sound of the crowd. Thousands of people, behind barricades, cheering, shouting names, singing. A tired smile appeared on Bowie's face. At least some things never changed. People still loved him, or at least they loved the characters he created. The Mercedes slowed down. The crowd looked ready to explode. Security guards were trying to hold the barricades. Photographers were getting into position, and Bowie took a deep breath. It was time. When he got out of the car, the screams increased. "David! David! David!" they shouted. But some were yelling Ziggy. Some were calling Duke. He noticed that nobody was saying David Jones. Maybe because David Jones no longer existed. Before boarding the train, he wanted to greet the crowd. Security guards suggested the open-top Mercedes. Bowie agreed. Maybe there should be one last goodbye. To London. To England. To his old life. The Mercedes slowly started moving. Bowie stood up, trying to find his balance. Wind hit his face, his hair flying. The crowd had gone mad. And in that moment, Bowie felt something. Something strange. As if his body didn't belong to him. As if someone else was in control. The thin white Duke, taking the stage one last time. Bowie raised his right hand. At first he was just waving. Then his arm rose, straight, upward, palm open. He held it there for exactly 3 seconds. Everything around him slowed down. Cameras clicked, silence, then screams again. But this time it was different. Some were shocked, some were angry, some didn't understand what had happened. And Bowie lowered his arm, smiled, and got out of the Mercedes. He walked toward the train. He didn't look back. But those 3 seconds had become eternal. One of the photographers, a man working for NME magazine, had captured the perfect angle. Bowie's arm fully raised, palm open, an ambiguous expression on his face. The next day, the photo was in the newspapers. Did Bowie give a Nazi salute? Headlines were everywhere. The phone exploded. The record label panicked. His manager went crazy. And Bowie, sitting on the train to Berlin, was looking out the window. He didn't know what he had done. He didn't even remember. It was supposed to be just a wave. Wasn't it? The next morning, May 3, 1976. Bowie was in Berlin. But the scandal was growing in London. The Sun newspaper. Bowie's Nazi salute shocks nation. Daily Mail. Is Rockstar a fascism sympathizer? NME was more cautious but still ran the photo on the front page. And worst of all, there was the social context. Bowie's recent interviews. What he had said about Hitler. His comment about Britain needing a strong leader. When it all came together, a narrative was forming. And that narrative was this. David Bowie was a fascist sympathizer. But the truth was far more complex. Because what happened at Victoria Station in that moment wasn't a political statement. It was a symptom of collapse. A product of the disconnected mind of a man who had been living on cocaine for 18 months. One of Bowie's closest friends during that period, guitarist Carlos Alomar, would recount years later, David couldn't control it during that time. The thin white Duke character had taken him over. And Duke was a dangerous character. Cold, reckless, authoritarian, a reflection of the dark side inside David. What you saw at Victoria Station wasn't David, it was Duke. But the world didn't know this, and Bowie wasn't making any statements. In Berlin, in the apartment at 155 Hauptstrasse, Bowie was watching the news. He saw his own face on television. That arm, that gesture. And for the first time, he was scared. Really scared. Because he didn't remember. How could he not remember? 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. But missing. A hole in his mind. And that hole explained everything. He had lost control. Not just of the character, but of himself. Iggy Pop came to him. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Booma quietly replied, "I don't know, but I know one thing. I need to stay here. If I go back to Los Angeles, I'll die." The first official statement came from the record label. RCA Records issued a press release. Mr. Bowie's gesture at Victoria Station has been misunderstood. He was simply greeting his fans. It has no political meaning whatsoever. But nobody believed it, because the photo was too clear, and Bowie's recent statements were fresh in memory. The press didn't stop. Every day, a new headline. Bowie remains silent. Rock fascist makes no statement. Fan letters started arriving. Some supportive, some damning. One letter particularly shook Bowie. It came from a Jewish fan. It read, "I saw you as my idol. Because of you, I had the courage to be different. But now, are you supporting an ideology that wanted to kill me? Answer. David, please answer." Bowie read that letter and cried. For the first time in years, he shed tears. Because he understood. He wasn't just hurting himself. He was hurting others. People had believed in him, been inspired by him, been emboldened because of him, and now he was disappointing them. 2 weeks later, in mid-May, Bowie made his first personal statement. In an interview, looking directly at the camera, "What happened at Victoria Station was misunderstood. I am not a Nazi. I am not a fascist. I never was. I never will be. But I was going through a period too complex to explain. And I said some things. I did some things that I'm ashamed of. I'm sorry." But was it enough? No. Because the damage was done. The image was tarnished. And worst of all, Bowie himself didn't fully know what had happened. During those first months in Berlin, Bowie slowly started returning to reality. Every morning he would wake up early, get on his bike with Iggy, and tour the city. They would pass by the wall, watch East Berlin, and pedal in silence. Cocaine use slowed down, then stopped. For the first time in 5 years, he was clean. And with a clear mind, his memories started coming back. He remembered that moment at Victoria Station. But it still wasn't clear. Just fragments, the crowd, the wind, his arm rising. And then, emptiness. He started seeing psychiatrists. He told them everything. Ziggy, Duke, the disappearance, the fears. And one psychiatrist told him, "David, you're experiencing dissociation. Your characters became so real that you're disappearing. At Victoria Station, you weren't in control. Duke was. And Duke was a dangerous character." The summer months of 1976 were a turning point for Boom. The shadow of the Victoria Station scandal still hung over him, but Berlin was healing him. The apartment on Hauptstrasse was simple. White walls, minimal furniture, large windows. Every morning he followed the same routine. Wake up early, wake Iggy, get on the bike, tour the city, have breakfast at a Turkish restaurant, go to the studio. Hansa Studios was right next to the Berlin Wall. From the window you could see the wall. And on the other side of the wall, another world. Boom stared at that wall for hours. And he understood that there was a wall inside him too. Between David Jones and the characters. And he needed to tear down that wall. He started working with Brian Eno. Eno wasn't a traditional rock musician. He was experimental, electronic, avant-garde, and he showed Booms a new path. Don't create characters. Eno said, create music. Pure, honest, personal music. The first album, Low, came out in early 1977. Half songs, half instrumental, emotional, raw, fragile, and completely Booms, without characters. For the first time in years, David Jones was speaking. Critics were surprised, fans were divided, but Boom didn't care, because finally he was honest. The Victoria Station scandal was still in the news. Some concerts were cancelled. Some radio stations refused to play his songs. But Boom continued. The second Berlin album, Heroes, came at the end of 1977, and the title track from that album changed everything. The song Heroes was about two lovers meeting by the wall, every day, in the same place, taking risks to see each other, because love was stronger than walls. But the song was also Boom's own story, his struggle to find himself, his effort to tear down the wall of characters. The line, "We can be heroes, just for one day," wasn't just a love song, it was a liberation manifesto. When the song was released, the world looked at Bowie again, but this time it was different. This wasn't Ziggy, it wasn't Duke, this was the real David Bowie. Fragile, honest, strong, and people started forgiving. Victoria Station was slowly being forgotten. It was being replaced by a new story. the return of a man from collapse. But Boom didn't forget. For years, those 3 seconds lived in his head. In every interview, journalists asked, "What happened at Victoria Station? Was it really a Nazi salute? Do you regret it?" And Boom answered every time. But the answers changed. In 1977, it was a mistake. It was misunderstood. In 1980, I was a sick man during that period. Cocaine was destroying me. In 1987, I'm ashamed. I wish it had never happened. In 1993, I'm not that man anymore, but I take responsibility. And in 2002, he gave the most honest answer. I don't fully remember what happened at Victoria Station, but I know one thing. That man wasn't David Jones. It was the thin white Duke. And Duke was my darkest side. I had to kill him. I killed him in Berlin. But before that, he did a lot of damage. This last confession was perhaps the most important, because Boom had finally understood. Characters weren't escape. They were prison. Ziggy, Aladdin, Duke, all of them were David Jones's ways of escaping reality. But reality always comes back. And when it comes back, reckoning is inevitable. Victoria Station was the symbol of that reckoning. The moment when a man lost control, when the character became real, and when the consequences were painful. For years, Boone avoided seeing that photo. But in the early 2000s, when looking through archives for a documentary, it confronted him. He saw himself. Young, thin, lost. And he cried. "That wasn't me," he said to the camera. But at the same time, it was me. Me at my worst. Today, the Victoria Station scandal is just one part of Boom's story. A dark part, but an important part. Because without that moment, there would be no Berlin. Without Berlin, there would be no heroes. Without heroes, there would be no Bowie Rebirth. The scandal was a turning point. The moment Bowie hit rock bottom. But hitting bottom is sometimes the only way to climb back up. Cocaine. Characters. Loss. Minus. All of it was symbolized there at Victoria Station in those 3 seconds. And what followed was a story of redemption. When Bowie died in 2016, the world remembered him as a legend. Musical genius. Visual innovator. Pioneer who broke gender norms. But some also remembered Victoria Station. And some asked, did we forgive? Should we forget? Or should we remember? Maybe the answer is this. We should both remember and connect. We should remember because history learns from mistakes. Victoria Station shows the dangers of fame, addiction, and identity loss. It's a warning to young artists. Your characters can destroy you. Addiction can steal reality, and one moment can change everything. But we should also forgive, because Bowie finally took account. He was regretful. He changed. And most importantly, he was honest. He faced his own darkness and conquered it. How many people can do that? How many of us can face our own mistakes so openly? Victoria Station was a moment of error. But Berlin was a story of redemption. And together they formed the complete picture of David Bowie. Not perfect, but real. Fragile but strong. Lost but finally found. Bowie's story is the story of an artist's search for identity. But it's also all of our stories. How many times do we wear a mask? At work, at school, in the family, on social media? How many times do we play the version others want to see, instead of being the real us? Bowie did this under stage lights, but the mechanism is the same, and so is the danger. If you wear the mask too long, you might not be able to take it off. Victoria Station was the endpoint of that danger. Bowie couldn't take off the mask because he no longer knew who was underneath. The thin white Duke was in control, and Duke was dangerous, cold, and reckless. But the story doesn't end just at Victoria Station, because the consequences of that scandal continued for years, and how Bowie tried to make up for those 3 seconds is perhaps more important than the character itself. In 1978, when the third Berlin album Lodger came out, Bowie was in a completely different place. He was now clean, balanced, and most importantly himself. But the past still wouldn't leave him alone. At his concerts, some protesters would come. They would shout Nazi Bowie. They carried signs and posters. And Bowie would quietly walk on stage, play his music and say nothing. Because what could he say? Words weren't more powerful than that photograph. In the early 1980s, Bowie made a commercial comeback. The Let's Dance album sold 10 million copies. MTV embraced him. He gained a new generation of fans. And slowly, Victoria Station began to be forgotten. But was it really forgotten? No. When the internet age came, everything came back. That photo was digitally everywhere. Forums, blogs, social media, everyone was talking. And a new question emerged. Can it be forgiven? In the internet age, the past never dies. A mistake is preserved forever. And Bowie was one of the first celebrities to experience this. In the 2000s, young journalists would ask him, "How do you explain Victoria Station?" And Bowie would tiredly reply, "Again? Still?" But he knew. It would always be there. In 2004, in an interview, a journalist asked directly, "Were you really a fascist?" Bowie stopped. A long silence. Then, "No, I never was. But during that period, I was a sick man, and sick people do sick things. I'm not saying that as an excuse, I'm saying it as a fact. The man you saw at Victoria Station was experiencing a mental breakdown. He was in the middle of cocaine psychosis, and he made a gesture that he would regret for the rest of his life. What else can I say? I apologized, I changed, I lived, and I learned. But that photograph will be there forever. I've learned to live with it." This was perhaps the most honest answer, because Bowie was no longer denying. He wasn't defending. He was just telling the truth. Yes, it happened. Yes, it was terrible. And yes, I'm sorry. But beyond Victoria Station, there's a bigger question. Why were the characters so dangerous? Throughout his career, Bowie created dozens of personas. Ziggy, Aladdin, Duke, Halloween Jack. Each one was an escape from David Jones. But why was he running? Psychologists suggested that Bowie had dissociative identity tendencies. Not a traumatic childhood, but an uncertain sense of self. David Jones didn't know who he wanted to be, so he tried being others. And for a while it worked. Ziggy made him famous. Duke tried to protect him, but eventually each character turned into a prison. Because the real David, deep down, was lost. In therapy sessions in Berlin, the psychiatrist asked him, "Do you know David Jones?" Bowie stopped. "No," he said. "I don't think so." "Well, would you like to know him?" Bowie closed his eyes. A long silence. Then, "Yes, I think it's time." This was the turning point. For the first time, Bowie decided to let go of the characters and find his real self. It wasn't easy. For years, the characters had protected him, but at the same time, they had imprisoned him. Now, it was time to be free. The Heroes album was the first expression of that freedom. Low and Lodger continued it. The Berlin trilogy was Bowie's journey of rediscovering himself, and in each album, a little more David Jones emerged. But in the 1980s, a new problem emerged. Commercial success. Let's Dance reached millions of people. But this success brought new pressure. The record label wanted more hits. Fans wanted the old Bowie, and Bowie was starting to disappear again. This time not in characters, but in others' expectations. The albums Tonight and Never Let Me Down were torn apart by critics. Bowie had become artistically lost, and worst of all, he knew it. In 1987, the Glass Spider Tour was a disaster. Giant stage shows, but no soul in the music. Bowie was performing on stage, but he was empty inside. He had turned into a character again, pop star Bowie. And he didn't love that character. In 1989, he decided, enough. He formed the band Tin Machine. Minimalist, hard, not commercial. Critics hated it. Fans were confused. But Bowie didn't care, because finally he was honest again. Tin Machine wasn't successful, but for Bowie, success didn't matter. Authenticity mattered. And in the early 1990s, he found himself again. Black Tie, White Noise. 1993. Earthling, 1997. Earthling, each was experimental, risky, personal. The old Bowie had returned, but this time without characters. Just David. The 2000s were calm years for Boom. He was married, happy, balanced. He was living in New York with Iman, his daughter Lexi was growing up, and life had normalized. He wasn't constantly touring anymore. He wasn't constantly making albums. He was just living. And for the first time, David Jones felt comfortable. In 2003, he had a heart attack on stage. A warning came. Slow down. And he slowed down. The next 10 years were quiet. Occasionally an interview, occasionally a guest appearance, but mostly silence. Fans wondered, had he retired? Was it over? But in 2013, the Next Day album came out as a surprise. Nobody was expecting it, and the album was brilliant. Critics were amazed. Bowie was still here, still creating, still relevant, but nobody knew that something was happening in the background. In January 2014, doctors diagnosed Bowie with liver cancer. It was advanced. It could be treated, but there were no guarantees. 18 months, maybe 2 years. Bowie received the news and wasn't shocked. He calmly asked, "What can I do?" The doctor, live well, and be prepared. Bowie went home and told Iman. They cried. Then Bowie said something that Iman would never forget. "I want to make one last album, But nobody will know. It will be a surprise, a farewell gift, and the Blackstar project began. The next 18 months turned into a secret race. Boom was working in the studio with Tony Visconti. Every week, a few hours. He was in pain, but never complained. Music was his final refuge, and Blackstar was his final masterpiece. The album was about death, but not fear, acceptance. Every song, a farewell. Every lyric, a meaning. And the most striking part, the videos. The Blackstar and Lazarus videos were Boom's final visual expressions. Blindfolded, trembling, on his deathbed, but still an artist, still creative, still in control. January 8, 2016, Boom's 69th birthday. Blackstar was released. The world applauded. Boom was back. Critics praised. His career's best. Fans celebrated. The legend has returned. But nobody knew. The symbols in the videos. The meanings in the lyrics. It was all a farewell message. And 2 days later, January 10, 2016, the world woke up and learned. David Bowie had died. After an 18-month silent battle, at home, with his family, he had gone in peace. And he had left his final gift, Blackstar. He had turned his own death into a work of art. Now, let's go back. Victoria Station, 1976. A man lost out of control makes a gesture. Chaos, scandal, collapse. Blackstar, 2016. The same man now mature, balanced, planning his last breath. Control, art, redemption. 40 years, 2 moments, 1 life. And in between, what did he learn? Characters can't save you. Only you can save yourself. At Victoria Station, Boom had disappeared inside the character. In Blackstar, he had finally found himself. And that finding allowed him to turn even death into art. Maybe that's the greatest lesson. You can't know how to die without knowing who you are. Boom found himself in Berlin. And 40 years later, with that knowledge, he left with dignity. The Victoria Station scandal now carries a different meaning in Boom's story. Not just a mistake, a turning point, the bottom of collapse, but also the beginning of rise. Those 3 seconds taught Boom something. Control is an illusion, characters are an escape, and real freedom is accepting yourself. Boom's learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it, and eventually he became one of the most authentic artists in the world. Because he was no longer trying to meet anyone's expectations. He was just being David Bowie. And that was enough. David Bowie's Victoria Station scandal should not be forgotten, because it carries an important lesson. Fame, addiction, and identity loss are a dangerous combination. It's a warning for young artists, celebrities, and even ordinary people. Wear a mask, but don't forget who's underneath. Create characters, but don't lose control. And when you make mistakes, take account, apologize, and change. Bowie did all of these. That's why, when we remember him today, we don't just remember the scandal, we remember the whole story. Collapse and rise, mistake and redemption, loss and finding. And finally, art. Pure, honest, eternal art. Those 3 seconds don't define David Bowie, but they help us understand him. Because everyone falls. The real question is how you get up. Bowie got up, in Berlin, with music, with honesty, and 40 years later, he left the world one final masterpiece. Blackstar wasn't just an album, it was a manifesto. Life is complex. You make mistakes, but in the end, if you know who you are, you can leave in peace. Victoria Station was the beginning, Blackstar was the end, and in between there was an incredible journey. David Bowie's journey. All of our journeys. The journey of finding, losing, and finding ourselves again. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. You don't have to be perfect. Being human is enough. Making mistakes is being human. Apologizing takes courage, and changing is real strength. Bowie did all of these. That's why today, we remember him not just as a rock star, but as a human being, with his flaws, his mistakes, his triumphs. And those 3 seconds at Victoria Station are no longer just a scandal. They're a reminder that being human is hard, but not impossible. When David Bowie died in 2016, the world mourned. Millions of people listened to his music, shared his story, and talked about his legacy. And yes, some mentioned Victoria Station too, but no longer as an accusation, as context, as part of Bowie's complex, difficult, but ultimately triumphant life. Because in the end, we're all complex. We all make mistakes, and we all deserve second chances. Bowie used his second chance, and he turned it into a legend.